On the morning of September 1st, 1939, 2 days before the Prime Minister would gravely announce that war had been declared on Germany, the railway stations of London, Manchester, Liverpool, and other major industrial hubs transformed into scenes of organized, industrial-scale heartbreak. Operation Pied Piper, the British government's radical contingency plan to save the next generation from the anticipated annihilation of aerial bombing, had commenced with a whistle-blow. It was a logistical undertaking without precedent in the history of the nation, mobilizing the entire transport network to move nearly 1.5 million people, mostly school-aged children, teachers, and mothers with infants, out of the designated urban danger zones and into the safety of the rural reception zones in a frantic period of just 3 days. The atmosphere on the platforms was a strange, dissonant mix of festive excitement and deeply suppressed, grinding terror. Children, many too young to understand the geopolitical precipice upon which their world stood, gathered in school playgrounds, clutching gas mask boxes and small battered suitcases. They were tagged like luggage, brown cardboard labels tied to their lapels bearing their names, schools, and destination codes, destinations that were often kept secret from the parents until the trains were actually moving, adding a layer of terrifying finality to the separation. The logistical scale of the operation required the absolute suspension of normal life across Britain. The standard railway timetable was scrapped entirely, replaced by a specialized emergency schedule dedicated solely to the endless stream of evacuation trains. Commercial traffic ceased, and the great steel arteries of the nation became one-way flows of humanity heading away from the cities. Teachers found themselves abruptly conscripted into the role of surrogate parents and logistical marshals, herding hundreds of excited, confused, or weeping children through the crush of the platforms. They carried clipboards and whistles, struggling to maintain order amidst the sheer volume of evacuees and the hiss of steam. The burden on these educators was immense and immediate. They were responsible not just for the physical transport of their charges, but for their emotional stability in a moment of supreme crisis. They had to reassure terrified 6-year-olds that this was just a holiday in the country, while they themselves looked at the sky with dread, wondering if the Luftwaffe would appear before the trains could depart the station. The moment of departure at the stations remains one of the most searing and traumatic images of the British home front. Parents were generally not allowed onto the platforms to prevent overcrowding and mass hysteria, meaning the final, agonizing goodbyes often took place at the ticket barriers or through the cold iron gates of the station entrance. Mothers pressed small packages of food, sweets, or Lucky Charms into their children's hands, fighting back tears with a stiff upper lip to appear brave for their little ones. Fathers, many of whom would soon be in uniform themselves, stood stoically, watching the trains pull away with a heavy sense of helplessness. For many children, this was the first time they had ever been separated from their parents for more than a few hours. As the steam engines hissed and the wheels began to turn, a collective wail often rose up from the carriages, a sound of raw, primal distress that haunted the railway staff who witnessed it. The train windows were filled with fluttering handkerchiefs and small hands waving frantically until the station disappeared from view, replaced by the grey industrial sprawl of a city they might not see again for years. The journey itself was an odyssey of confusion, discomfort, and fluctuating emotions. The trains were packed to capacity, often with no corridors or toilets accessible due to the overcrowding of bodies and luggage. Children sat on their cases or on the floor, the air thick with the smell of steam, stale sandwiches, and anxious sweat. As the urban landscape gave way to green fields and open sky, the mood often shifted among the younger travellers. For the thousands of children from the slums of the East End or the industrial North, the countryside was an alien planet. They pressed their faces against the glass, marvelling at cows and sheep, animals they had only ever seen in picture books or on packaging. Yet, this wonder was brittle and short-lived. As the hours dragged on, and the trains stopped at unknown stations to take on water or let troop transports pass, the reality of their isolation began to set in. They were traveling into the void, with no idea where they would sleep that night or who would be looking after them. Arrival in the reception areas, quiet market towns, seaside villages, and farming communities brought a collision of worlds that would redefine the British class system. The trains disgorged their exhausted cargo onto rural platforms, where the local WVS, Women's Voluntary Service, and billeting officers were waiting to process them. The children, now tired, hungry, and dirty from the long journey, were marched to local village halls, schools, or churches for the selection process. This phase of the evacuation is frequently remembered with bitterness and humiliation by the evacuees. It resembled a cattle market. Potential host families would walk along the lines of children, inspecting them for cleanliness and demeanor. The clean, well-dressed, and polite-looking children were picked first. Brother and sister were often separated in the scramble, despite government promises to keep families together. The unwanted ones, those with skin conditions, lice, bedraggled clothes, or sullen expressions, were left until last, eventually forced upon reluctant hosts by the billeting officer using the force of the law. The billeting officer was the linchpin of the entire system, a figure of immense power and stress in the local community who had the legal authority to compel householders to take in children. The government paid a small allowance, 10 shillings and 6 pence for the first child, but this rarely covered the actual cost of feeding and clothing a growing youth. The billeting officer had to navigate a minefield of social reluctance and class prejudice. Wealthy homeowners with large empty spare rooms often pleaded exemptions or refused point-blank to take in slum children, while working-class cottagers, who had little to spare, often ended up taking the bulk of the evacuees. The friction was immediate and palpable. The officer had to be part diplomat, part enforcer, dragging reluctant hosts to the village hall and forcing them to do their patriotic duty. This bureaucratic coercion sowed seeds of resentment before the evacuees had even crossed the threshold, creating a tense atmosphere in the homes where these frightened children were meant to find sanctuary. The first night in the billet was often a traumatic experience for both the child and the host family. Alone in a strange room, with strange smells and strange noises, the intense silence of the countryside was often more terrifying to a city child than the noise of traffic. The reality of the separation hit home with devastating force. Homesickness was an epidemic. Children cried themselves to sleep, calling for their mothers in the dark. Bedwetting, enuresis, became a massive, widespread issue, a physical manifestation of the intense psychological stress they were under. For the host families, finding wet sheets in the morning was a source of anger and disgust, confirming their prejudices about the dirty city children. Many hosts were kind and patient, but many were not equipped to deal with traumatized children. Some children were scolded, shamed, or beaten for their distress. That first night marked the beginning of a struggle for adaptation that would test the resilience of the nation's youth. The evacuation exposed the deep, rigid class divisions of 1930s Britain in a way that no political pamphlet ever could. The town versus country clash was really a clash of extreme poverty and relative affluence. Many of the evacuees came from severe urban deprivation homes with no indoor toilets, no running water, and severe overcrowding. When they arrived in the respectable middle-class homes of the countryside, the culture shock was total. Hosts were horrified to find children who had been sewn into their underwear for the winter, who had never used a knife and fork, or who had no concept of sleeping in a bed of their own. The discovery of head lice and impetigo among the evacuees caused panic and revulsion in the reception areas. The hosts often viewed the children as feral. The children viewed the hosts as snobs. This social friction revealed the ugly truth of inequality in Britain, forcing the rural middle class to confront the squalor in which the urban working class had been allowed to live. The perspective of the host families was complex and often fraught with genuine hardship that is frequently overlooked. While history often focuses on the plight of the child, the burden on the foster mothers was significant and exhausting. They were suddenly expected to cook, clean, and care for strangers, often unruly and traumatized children, with no training and little support. Their domestic routines were shattered. A quiet retirement could be overturned by the arrival of 3 boisterous boys from the London docks. The allowance provided by the government was meagre, meaning hosts often had to dip into their own savings to provide adequate food or shoes for the children. Resentment brewed, not necessarily out of malice, but out of sheer exhaustion. They were doing their war duty, but the invasion of their privacy was absolute. The sanctity of the private home was violated by the state's mandate, creating a pressure cooker environment. Daily life for the evacuees settled into a strange, disjointed rhythm of integration and segregation. They had to integrate into local village schools, which were often overwhelmed by the sudden influx of students. Shifts were organized, with local children attending in the morning and evacuees in the afternoon, further segregating the two groups and fueling animosity. The playground became a battlefield where urban street smarts clashed with rural insularity. Name-calling and fighting were common as the evacuees, defended their territory against the yokels. Yet, for many, the countryside offered freedoms they had never known. They climbed trees, swam in rivers, and breathed clean air for the first time. They ate fresh vegetables instead of tinned food. For the children who landed in good homes, the evacuation became a golden age of childhood adventure, a stark contrast to the soot and grime of the city. Letters home were the only lifeline to the old world, but they were an imperfect and heavily filtered medium. Younger children couldn't write, so they relied on their hosts or teachers to scribe for them, meaning the true extent of their unhappiness was often censored to be polite. Older children, trying to be brave or instructed not to worry their parents, wrote formulaic letters: "I am fine, the food is nice, please send sweets." The censorship of emotion was a national trait. Parents in the city would receive these letters and read between the lines, looking for signs of distress, but feeling powerless to intervene. The postal service carried the emotional weight of the separation, delivering parcels of jam and knitted jumpers one way, and letters of longing the other. The gap between the written word and the lived reality was often a chasm of silence where the child's trauma remained unspoken. By late 1939 and early 1940, the phony war created a new crisis for the scheme: the drift back. The anticipated bombing raids did not materialize immediately, and the silence of the skies made the separation seem pointless and cruel. Parents, missing their children and hearing stories of mistreatment, or simply unable to bear the quiet house, began to bring them home in droves. The government pleaded with them to leave the children in safety, issuing posters with slogans like, "Don't do it, Mother, leave the children where they are." But the parental instinct overrode the state's logic. By January 1940, nearly half of the evacuees had returned to the cities, a massive reverse migration that undid the work of Operation Pied Piper. Families reunited, relieved, unaware that they were bringing their children back just in time for the real horror of the Blitz to begin. When the Blitz finally began in earnest in September 1940, the second wave of evacuation was far more frantic, desperate, and less organized. This was no longer a precautionary drill. The bombs were actually falling. Children who had returned were sent away again, often to different billets, compounding their sense of instability and rejection. This yo-yo evacuation caused profound psychological damage. Children learned not to attach themselves to anyone or any place. They became transient beings, living out of suitcases, always waiting to be moved. The second wave also saw the evacuation of coastal towns, as the threat of invasion turned the seaside resorts into militarized zones. The safe areas were shrinking. The urgency of this second exodus meant that the niceties of the first wave were abandoned. Children were shipped out to wherever there was space, often ending up in remote parts of Wales or Scotland, where the language barrier added another layer of isolation. The psychological toll of the evacuation is now recognized as a significant national trauma, though at the time it was clinically termed settling in issues. Many children developed attachment disorder, effectively detaching themselves emotionally from their parents to survive the pain of separation. When parents visited, the children would often be cool, distant, or even hostile, punishing them for the abandonment. Bedwetting, speech impediments, and aggressive behavior were common symptoms of the stress. The term evacuee mentality emerged a sense of not belonging anywhere, of always being a guest in someone else's life. These children were forced to grow up overnight, managing their own emotions and navigating complex adult social hierarchies without the safety net of unconditional parental love. They became resilient, but brittle. It must be acknowledged that for a minority of children, the evacuation was a nightmare of abuse and neglect that scarred them for life. The vetting of host families was virtually non-existent in the rush to clear the cities. Some children were placed with individuals who were mentally unstable, cruel, or sexually predatory. There were widespread reports of evacuees being used as unpaid farm labor, worked into the ground from dawn until dusk, picking potatoes or tending animals. Others were locked in rooms, starved, or subjected to physical and sexual abuse. The isolation of the rural billets meant there was often no one to turn to. The billeting officers were often too busy or too dismissive to investigate complaints. These dark stories were suppressed at the time to maintain morale, but they represent the shadow side of Operation Pied Piper, the state failing in its duty of care. Conversely, for many slum children, the evacuation was a life-saving health intervention that changed their physical destiny. The diet in the cities during the Depression of the 1930s had been appalling, consisting of bread, margarine, and tea. In the countryside, despite rationing, the availability of fresh milk, eggs, and vegetables, combined with the clean air, led to a visible improvement in the physical health of the vackies. They grew taller, put on weight, and their cheeks regained color. They were treated for lice and skin diseases that had plagued them for years. For some, it was the first time they slept in a bed with sheets or wore sturdy boots. This exposure to a better standard of living radicalized a generation. Once they had seen how the other half lived, they were less willing to accept the squalor of the pre-war slums when they returned. A tragic footnote to the evacuation story was the Children's Overseas Reception Board, CORB, which aimed to send children to Canada, Australia, and South Africa to escape the war entirely. This program was popular, but short-lived. On September 17, 1940, the liner City of Benares, carrying 90 evacuees to Canada, was torpedoed by a German U-boat in the stormy Atlantic. The ship sank rapidly in rough seas, and 77 of the children died, huddled in freezing lifeboats or washing away in the dark water. The news devastated the British public. The idea that children were being killed in the very act of being saved was too much to bear. The overseas evacuation program was immediately halted. It served as a grim reminder that in total war there was no sanctuary, and that the ocean was as much a battlefield as the sky over London. The end of the war in 1945 brought the complex, messy, and prolonged process of return. There was no singular return day. The repatriation dragged on for months. For children who had been away for 4 or 5 years, the return was not a joyous reunion, but a frightening displacement. They had forgotten their parents. They had grown up in the countryside, acquired local accents, and adopted the values of their host families. Returning to a bomb-damaged, cramped city terrace was a shock. Many didn't want to leave their aunties and uncles in the country. The bonds formed over the war years were ripped apart, mirroring the trauma of the initial separation. The trains back to London were filled with tears, just as they had been in 1939, but this time for the loss of the rural life they had come to love. Reintegration into the family unit was difficult and fraught with emotional landmines. Mothers found their children changed, more independent, critical, or distant. Fathers returning from the front found strangers living in their house. The stranger in the house syndrome affected thousands of families. The children often viewed their biological parents as the people who had sent them away, harboring deep-seated resentment. The parents, who had suffered the terror of the Blitz, felt their sacrifice in sending the children away was unappreciated. It took years to rebuild these fractured relationships. The psychological distance created by the evacuation persisted long into peace, a quiet domestic legacy of the war that played out in living rooms across the country. Ultimately, the legacy of Operation Pied Piper was profound and transformative for British society. It was a social experiment on a massive scale that mixed the classes of Britain as never before. It made the condition of the urban poor visible to the rural middle class and the government, contributing significantly to the post-war consensus that created the welfare state and the National Health Service. The Beveridge Report, which laid the foundations for the NHS, was fueled by the evidence of poverty exposed by the evacuation. But beyond the politics, the legacy remains in the memories of the evacuees, a generation who carried the experience of the train, the tag, and the suitcase with them for the rest of their lives, defined forever by the time they were sent away to be saved.